art for me has always just been something that I have always had a compulsion to do. I think that when I get interested in something, I get like really interested and I'll like do research and I'll be like really gung-ho about that. But it seems that to me, like I'll be like super into something for like whatever the period is, like a year or 3 years or whatever it is. And then I'll kind of find a new sort of thing that I'm interested in. But I think art has sort of always been my main like obsession. A few years ago, I picked up Kendama, which is that like little like ball and cup toy. I had bought one and then I was learning sort of all these different ways of doing it, and it kind of brought it here to my studio as a way to not get like sucked in my computer or my phone while I was waiting. If everything was sort of wet, I would kind of be able to do something that was like a little bit dexterity based and a little bit exercise, like there's a lot of squatting involved. But it was a good way to just like, okay, I'm just gonna like think about this little wooden toy for a while, and then like I can go back and paint in like 10 or 15 minutes. So I went to Mass Art in Boston, and so I went for printmaking. You know, I was making these big etchings, like 2-foot etchings, and then I was layering. They were all about 3 plates each, and then I was taking all of those plates and kind of shuffling them together. And at the end, I was doing like, 10 plate etchings, and there were different gradients in all of the etchings. And once I graduated, didn't have access to a print studio, so I was trying to think of a place to do that, and then sort of what the work wanted to be, and I was adding more and more and more colors. And with etching, the more colors you add, the more plates you have, the more complex it is, and then it becomes more expensive. And I was like, these are almost paintings. I should see, what they would look like as paintings. And I sort of started doing it then. I guess technically they could be considered like monotypes, because I'm using tape and masking to make a shape, and then I'm painting inside of that shape and then removing all of the tape. So they're basically just big stenciled pieces, but they're all one-offs. I couldn't recreate them. I'm a pretty rigid and process-based person. There are a few little pieces that are freehand, but it doesn't happen very often. And I think that the color is sort of where I allow myself some sort of freedom to sort of build the piece as it's happening. So I'm not just like replicating the drawing. A lot of the compositional planning happens in the sketching. I do about, I would say maybe like 85% complete. So I have a little bit of wiggle room when I'm painting to either add or subtract something. And then I start painting and just kind of go from the background to the foreground. And the tape and the masking sort of allows me to go back in. So the color is the last intuitive thing that I have not planned. I'll maybe have a color scheme or an idea of what I think the colors should be. But if I mask something off and I take all the tape off and then the color is not what I want, or it's not working correctly, I can just wait for the paint to dry and then remask it and then paint it over with a different color or pattern or whatever I want. And there's times where I've done that like 4 or 5, 6 times. Having to spend money on a space that doesn't make you much money always, sort of makes you come in here and think, like at least myself, like I'm spending rent on this. I should like come in and just like get as much like personal enjoyment out of making the pieces as I can, because making the work is also like a big part of why I do it. Like the enjoyment out of like crafting the piece and spending a lot of time like fiddling away and like spending 8 hours like masking, cutting, and painting something can sort of be like good for my brain. I think what I really enjoy is when someone has bought a piece for me. It's really nice to go to their place and see how it's sort of interacting with the things that they have deemed that are also important. I think that's sort of what I'm doing in the piece, is trying to, in my own way, visually find what's important to me. So it's interesting to see my work amongst the things that they're, they have deemed important. A lot of my work deals with memory. So a lot of these shapes that are in my work are things that I've like looked at, and I think I'm trying to remember what visually is interesting about them to me. So I kind of record them in my sketchbook. So that's like the first iteration. And then I'm taking that and like either scaling it up or scaling it down and drawing it, and then thinking maybe that's not the correct shape, or it looked a little bit different in the sketch. So then I erase it all and redraw it. And then once I mask off the painting, I'm painting that shape, I'm redrawing it again, and then I'm cutting it again with the knife and then painting it again. So it's kind of in my thought process, thinking about how memories change or shift. The more you think about them, or the more you're explaining the memory to someone. You don't know exactly what the item is, but you can understand that this is like an organic item, or this thing sort of looks like a leaf, or this vessel sort of looks man-made. So the viewer can kind of put their own interpretation onto what these items are. My work also has a lot to do with like collecting these visual memories and gestures in my sketchbook. And I'm also like collecting like little scraps of things that come off of the pieces as I'm making them. I think that giant tape monster is a good representation of that. One of the things that gets me really excited are the people here in Portland and in Maine in general. I think that there's such a good community that's so welcoming. When I first came here, I think I went to, like the first opening I went to, my friend Andrew was just like introducing me to people, and like, oh, this is Jimmy, he paints. And everyone's like, oh, sure, like, what's your Instagram? I want to know what you're doing. And I think that is sort of infectious here. I think that people are really excited and happy for other people to win. Which I think is a really great way to look at art. I feel like I get really like excited and stoked if someone has like they have a new show opening, or there's a mural going up somewhere. I'm always so happy to see people that are excited about making things like succeed in their making. And I think I picked Portland because my studio mate in college already lived here. And he was like, oh, you should come up and visit. And when I came up and visited, thought it was sort of a perfect match for me. There's enough sort of city life things happening. It doesn't feel overwhelming. Like New York feels very overwhelming to me. And, you can go to the water, which is great. And you travel like an hour, so you can go and do like a nice hike or be in the woods. And I think it was a good balance for me to have all of that so easily accessible. A lot of what I like about using paint as a medium, there's sort of all of these kind of like little tricks that you can do with paint to get a completely different feel. Like I could have everything be really flat, or I could have something have more texture or depth. The paintings sort of become like a time lapse of certain length, but depending on which shapes I'm picking from. So I have all these sketchbooks, and maybe I'll find a shape that works compositionally that's a few years old, or something that I drew yesterday. So a painting could be a small collection of memories from maybe like 2 years or a few months. I generally work on more than one piece at a time. A lot of the paint that I'm using will either have like a texture, or sometimes I'm building up I use acrylic, so I'm building up the acrylic really thick. Sometimes that needs a while to dry. So I'll get one thing painted, and like while it's wet, I'll move my fan over there, and while it's drying, I'll start working on the new piece. And I'll kind of bounce back and forth between like 2 or 3 pieces generally, because some of them take a lot longer. Like there are some pieces that I'll like, they'll just be up on the wall, and I'll be working on it for like either like a year or something. Well, some will take me like a month. So I think that some of the pieces I can like, oh yeah, like I finished like 3 or 4 other pieces while I was making this one piece, and I can sort of see tricks or things that I was using in those other pieces in the piece that took longer. A lot of times all I'll do to warm up is like do a bunch of these sort of quick gestures, but I sort of think of those gestures that go through the piece as sort of like maybe some extended version of myself. It's a representation of something that I'm putting onto the paper very quickly, not really thinking about. And then it's also sort of a way to give the piece a little bit of depth visually, because they sort of go in and around and behind all of the other shapes. More recently, I've been using, like I'll get a big piece of tracing paper, and then once all of the sort of visual components are in the piece, I'll take it and I'll trace the entire composition, and then I'll go back and mask the whole thing, and then I can sort of move it depending on where I think the light should be coming from. I think also it's sort of like you can see that there's a light on this thing, sort of like if someone had like a nice collection of something in their house, or had like a shelf of knickknacks that like a light was hitting, and you can see that they're like spot lit, or there's some sort of importance being brought to these objects. All your work doesn't need to be immediately seen. There are lots of paintings that I make that aren't good or finished, or that I'll never show anyone. I think it's important to realize that like as long as you're just kind of working on whatever you think you need to be working on, that's important. I used to have this professor who would say, I think it was, if you don't go to your studio every day, how will you know if your muse is there? And I don't know if there's a studio muse, but I think that it's important to sort of just, take the time to work on whatever you think is important to work on, whether that's coming in and, working on a painting, or doing some research, or reading about artists who you think have similar ideas. I think it's really important to just spend the time thinking about what you want to make and also working on the things you're making.